Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Measuring School Performance for Improvement, a framework for diagnostic use of data. Before we begin, please take note of the following functionality features. All participants have been muted upon entry for the best sound quality possible. If you encounter issues in the WebEx platform, please use the chat window located in the bottom right corner of the screen. Select Host from the drop-down list, type your message in the window, and press Enter. We will do our best to address your needs. If you'd like to pose a question or comment to our presenters, please use that same chat window. In the Ask drop-down list, please select All Panelists and click Send or press Enter. We will monitor the questions as they come in. Closed captioning is available through the multimedia viewer located in the lower right corner of the screen. Click the three vertical dots in the lower right corner and the URL link is added. I will add the URL link in the chat window to be copied and pasted in another browser if desired. Now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Brian Gill from Mathematica to begin our event. Brian, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Rick. So as Rick said, my name is Brian Gill. I direct the Mid-Atlantic Regional Educational Lab at Mathematica. Thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Regional Educational Labs, they are 10 labs across the country funded by the Institute for Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education to work with state and local educators and policymakers on issues related to research and analysis. And a lot of that work involves measurement of educational performance. So today's webinar and the framework I'll describe is informed by various measurement projects that we have conducted with the state and local officials over the last 5 years. And I'm happy to say that several of those stakeholders we've worked with have joined today to talk about the framework and more broadly about how they use measures of educational performance in decision making. So we have Donna Johnson and Evan Kramer, who work on accountability and research in the District of Columbia's Office of the State Superintendent. Tanya Walford, who directs accountability research in the School District of Philadelphia. She'll be able to provide a district perspective. Gene Pinkard from the Aspen Institute has a wide-ranging perspective based on his current work with various districts across the country and his own experience as a school and district administrator. And Carolyn Finici from the Council of Chief State School Officers has graciously agreed to facilitate our panel discussion and the Q&A that will follow my presentation. So thanks very much to all of our panelists for joining us today. This is a great group to talk about these ideas and potential policy implications. So, so I'll take the first 25 minutes or so to talk about a framework for diagnostic use of data to measure educational performance for improvement before we turn it over to the panel discussion and addressing some of the questions and answers that you as an audience might have. After that, we'll finish with a very, very brief feedback survey that we hope you'll take 2 minutes to fill out. Our funders at the U.S. Department of Education are eager to hear from you about what you thought about this. And in the meantime, you can feel free to put any questions you might have for our panel into the chat, as Rick mentioned earlier. You can do that at any time during the presentation or the panel discussion. Carolyn will be monitoring those questions, and we'll answer as many as we can before the end of the hour. So that's the plan for today. Let me talk a little bit about the motivation for this. And that's about making data useful to educators and policymakers for improvement. As I'm sure you all know, you and other educators and policymakers are often implored to be data-driven, to be evidence-based. But unfortunately, a lot of the data that are out there aren't actionable, aren't useful for the decisions that you need to make. And helping educators and policymakers make sense of the data so that it can be used for improvement and not just for research is a major focus and aim of the regional educational laboratories, including REL Mid-Atlantic. In my view, the pandemic has made the need for actionable measures even more apparent than it was before. We need measures that are rich, broad, and actionable, even more now than in the past. And one of the ways that's become evident is that in the wake of the pandemic, with state assessments being entirely canceled in 1 year and seriously disrupted in another year, a lot of state agencies have less data than they're used to happening. At the same time that many districts are drowning in data from the learning management systems that they had to rely on so extensively in remote instruction and are surely continuing to rely on for operational purposes. Now, one thing I want to recognize at the beginning is that data use can go wrong in a whole lot of different ways for performance management. Some of you may be familiar with the name Frederick Winslow Taylor. Frederick Winslow Taylor, at the turn of the 20th century, over 100 years ago, was what you might call the original management consultant. This was a guy he wrote a book called Principles of Scientific Management, based on going into factories and steel mills and taking a million different measurements of distances between workers and machines and things like that, and claiming to be able to develop scientific management principles from that. Well, in fact, a lot of this stuff was bunk. And he was claiming to have good measures of a lot of things that he didn't actually have very good measures of. And I think that that's a kind of caution that we need to be aware of, those of us who look at data and analyze data in education all the time. And they can lead us wrong in a variety of different ways. First of all, measures can be incomplete. If we measure reading and math proficiency, but not proficiency in science and social studies, we're going to be missing something. When we attach high stakes to them, sometimes they can distort behavior. Maybe we double the reading and math classes and stop teaching science and social studies. We can interpret measures in ways that aren't reliable. If we have a measure that changes dramatically from one day to the next or 1 year to the next, we can end up chasing random variation. Sometimes we can misattribute measures, seeing a student outcome and attributing it to a particular program when it might have been caused by something else entirely. And then finally, there's often a disconnect between the outcome measures that we follow for students and the processes producing them. So we may know something about how students are doing. We may even know something about how schools are performing, but very often the measures don't tell us what's happening in schools to produce those outcomes. So the question here is, how do we avoid those pitfalls and ensure that the data that we're using and that we're giving to educators and decision makers are diagnostic and actionable? And it's my contention that that a framework for these kind of measures can help with that, because it can help us to recognize the particular ways in which particular kinds of data can be useful and actionable for some purposes and not for others. So what I'm proposing here is a three-part framework where each kind of measure in each part addresses a particular question. The first one is student outcomes, answering the question, how are the kids doing in the short and the long term? And that, of course, is diagnostic for identifying the needs of students and collectively identifying the needs of schools. The second category is about impact on those outcomes. How much does the school or the program or the educational process contribute to how kids are doing, which is distinct from the outcome itself? And that's the kind of measure, like, say, a value-added measure, for example, or a student growth measure that might be diagnostic for identifying whether a school is underperforming or overperforming. And then third are measures related to processes that might be producing those outcomes and impacts. What's addressing the question, what's happening in the school or the classroom? And those kind of measures are diagnostic for identifying ways, identify places where intervention might be necessary, and potentially also for identifying underperformance and overperformance. So I want to talk a little bit in the next few minutes about examples of each of these types, just as illustrations, some of which we've worked on with our panel members today. So starting with student outcomes, you're all familiar with this. We're trying to understand how students are doing. And the first point to recognize is that we need broad and rich measures of student outcomes. So there are lots of critiques, of course, of high stakes testing. In my view, the strongest one is that the tests don't measure everything we want kids to learn. And the Every Student Succeeds Act, to some extent, recognized this by expanding the older measures from No Child Left Behind beyond proficiency in reading and math to include things like graduation, chronic absenteeism, college readiness, and other measures of success. But there are all sorts of other student outcome measures we might include as well. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking just about state accountability systems, ESSA compliant accountability systems. Here we're just talking about measures that might be used for diagnostic and performance management purposes, whether they're included in formal accountability systems, whether they're at the state level or the district level. This framework is intended to be a broad one. In any case, student outcome measures could include post-secondary enrollment, could include things like workforce participation in adulthood, those kinds of long-term measures. And then they can also include things like social emotional learning that is getting so much attention lately. And things like citizenship, which we rarely talk about for measurement purposes, but I'd argue is historically a pretty important aim of public schools. So I'm going to give you just a couple examples in the last two categories related to projects that we've worked on. In particular, REL Mid-Atlantic has done some work on measuring social emotional learning in both Pennsylvania and in the District of Columbia. In DC Public Schools, we helped the district create an index of whether students are loved, challenged, and prepared using student survey measures on social emotional learning. This index isn't used for formal accountability purposes, but the district does report district-wide results publicly every year. In Pennsylvania, we analyzed student and staff survey data to create an index of school climate that includes measures of social emotional learning. Again, this one is not used for formal accountability. Schools choose whether they're going to participate in this survey and then decide what to do with the information. In the work we've done, we've found that the surveys can produce useful information on social emotional learning at the school level. Of course, they're primarily designed to provide information on individual students. But we've seen that it is possible to get good response rates across a school from students as well as from staff. We've seen that school-wide social emotional learning measures show good psychometric characteristics. And that social emotional learning varies not only among individual students, but also on average across schools. We've also seen that there are reasons for caution in interpreting some of those results. So for example, it turns out there are systematic differences in social emotional learning across grade levels and ages. This is data from the DC Public Schools showing how 4 different indices of social emotional competencies change across grade levels systematically. And as you can see here, they demonstrate something that I think lots of students, parents, and teachers already know, which is that for many kids, 9th grade sucks. And the implication here is if we're thinking about this as understanding school performance as one measure of understanding what and student needs, is that it probably is a good idea to make comparisons at the same grade levels, because there are some issues, some developmental issues probably in kids that affect these overall. Civics is the second other outcome I want to mention that, of course, is, as far as I know, has not been included in formal accountability systems anywhere and is rarely measured at all. But historically, you can go back to the Horace Mann, often viewed as the founder of public education in this country. Historically, the reason that we all pay taxes to support public education is because it serves the public purpose of preparing kids for citizenship. And in fact, we've done research showing that when you do measure this, you can find that schools can have a big effect on whether students, once they graduate, turn 18, and become eligible, whether they actually register and vote. This is from a study we did of a charter school management organization called Democracy Prep that focuses specifically on civic preparation. And they were able to increase the rates of registration and voting of their graduates by substantial amounts. This is the sort of thing that could be measured and tracked in public schools more generally. So those are some examples of the first category, student outcomes. Second category, as I mentioned before, is impacts on student outcomes. So we can measure how well the kids are doing in a variety of different dimensions and ways, short and long terms. But separately, it's important to try to get a sense of how much the school is contributing, right? And this is related to a debate that goes back to the origination of No Child Left Behind 20 years ago. A lot of the critics recognized that if we just look at the student outcomes, raw proficiency results, say, in reading and math, then we can't really distinguish the school's performance and the school's contribution to that from what the students bring. And those kind of critiques are what prompted the development of measures like value-added measures and student growth measures, which do a better job of assessing how much schools are contributing. But we've got this situation now where we've been expanding the outcomes that people are looking at, post-secondary readiness, social emotional learning, any of the others, without realizing that we may be replicating that same original flaw of NCLB if we don't apply the statistical techniques to distinguish the school's contribution from how well the kids would have done regardless of what schools they went to. And so, but we could in fact do that. The last thing I want to say here is that accountability arguments about how much outcomes versus impacts should be weighed, how much status should count versus growth, proficiency versus value added, that those in some sense miss the point because these two types of measures, outcomes in the first category, impacts in this one, are diagnostic for different purposes. So you could have a situation where a low status, high growth school could end up with the same overall rating. You combine them as a high status and low growth school, but in fact, those two schools need very different interventions from each other. And I want to talk about some work we've done with both DC and our colleagues on the panel here, and with Louisiana on measures we're calling promotion power, where the promotion power approach is designed to apply the same kinds of statistical methods that are used in value-added and growth models to outcomes like graduation, college enrollment, and potentially other outcomes. Could be applied to registration and voting, could be applied to earnings in the mid-20s. The idea being we try to account for the differences in advantages and disadvantages that students served and put schools on a level playing field, give the policymakers and administrators better diagnostic information. So what does that mean? Here's some data from the work we did in Louisiana, where each dot shows a different high school across the state of Louisiana. And on the vertical axis, you see the college enrollment rate of students from each one of those high schools, wide variation. On the horizontal axis, you see the poverty level, increasing poverty to the right. So it won't surprise anybody that the schools that, on average, the schools that have higher poverty levels tend to have lower college enrollment rates. But I want to point you to the two schools we've highlighted in yellow here. They have basically identical college enrollment rates, But one of them is serving, the one on the left is serving a population of students that are not very disadvantaged. Very few of them are in poverty. These kids would do well even if they were at another school. The yellow dot on the right, they get the same college outcomes with a much, much more disadvantaged populations. They were way above that green line, suggesting that they are producing very large promotion power. They are promoting, dramatically increasing the college enrollment rates of their students. And we need to be able to distinguish, and policymakers need to be able to distinguish those schools from each other. This matters a lot. Schools with higher promotion power dramatically increase students' probability of graduating high school. They can be shown as dramatically increasing students' probability of enrolling in college, persisting in college. And there are differences in earnings at age 26 here, as you can also see. Again, this is data from Louisiana. So those are the second category. Third and final category, educational processes. We need to know what's happening inside the school. We need to know not only how the students are doing and how much schools are contributing, but what might be the processes in the schools that are producing the impacts and outcomes. So process measures can do some things that these impact and outcome measures can't do. In particular, they can help identify areas for possible intervention. So even if an impact measure gives us a good and reliable measure of performance, puts the schools serving different kids on a level playing field, it's a black box. It doesn't tell us how or why those things are happening. So the kinds of things we might measure for processes could include observations of instructional practice, could include surveys of school climate, could include measures of student participation, such as the ones that so many districts are getting now from their learning management systems electronically. Could include things like the kinds of school inspections that have been common in England and parts of Europe for a long time. Could include measures of exclusionary discipline, particularly focused on equity issues. And even could include some of the old-fashioned traditional measures of things like class size and teacher qualifications and experience. They can help compensate for some of the weaknesses of the outcome and impact measures. As I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges is that our measures of student outcomes tend to be incomplete. But even so, there's good evidence that people can recognize good schools and good teaching by observing it. Even students seem to be able to do this, research evidence suggests. Then in addition, the process measures are important because there are some kinds of impacts that we don't know how to measure at all. So for example, there is lots of good research suggesting that it's possible with the right methods to produce measures of value added of teachers and schools that are valid and reliable. But nobody's been able to figure out how to do this for principals, for individual principals. We know that principals matter a lot, but that's a much different story from being able to identify the impact of individual principals on outcomes. So the process measures are important. And so I'll talk briefly about some work we've done specifically on school climate, which we've worked on in Pennsylvania, in DC, and in Maryland. And we've seen interesting findings suggesting that if you talk to students and staff about school climate, you end up getting indications that they're correlated. They can tell you similar stories about schools, but they also differ, interestingly, in systematic ways. Teachers tend to think that their instruction is more rigorous than the students think. Students tend to think that they are better prepared than teachers tend to think. On this issue, particularly as related to principals, one of the things we've been able to see, and this is from DC Public Schools, is that school climate changes substantially when a school gets a new principal. And these are a variety of dimensions of school climate where you can see changes with a new principal that are much larger than the changes you see in the student outcomes and percent proficient. And that shouldn't be too surprising because of course, principals don't directly teach kids. To the extent that they influence those student outcomes, the influence has to be indirect, right? It's about how they change the instructional culture, how they change staffing, how they find ways to help their teachers perform better, all of which could take time and may not happen immediately when things change. But the school climate, particularly this leadership dimension, can change quite quickly, suggesting that the climate measure can provide a window on the performance of principals that we wouldn't be able to get if we were only looking at the student outcome measures. So that's the framework. I want to close here with a couple of possible implications for policy and practice before turning it over to our panel. One is that as a policy matter, I think it's important that we try to broaden our policy discussion of performance beyond student outcomes and beyond formal consequences. In education policy in the last 20 years, when we've used the word accountability, we have tended to mean something very specific, which is formal consequences attached to student outcomes. But in fact, there's lots of evidence from cognitive science and psychology that there are many other ways to create accountability too. That's only the formal consequences for outcomes is only one of them. The information alone can motivate in many circumstances, even if there aren't formal consequences. There's real reason to be concerned about applying consequences to some particular kinds of measures which might be too easily corrupted or influenced if formal consequences for it were attached to them. Social emotional learning seems likely to be one of those measures that its diagnostic value could decline if high stakes were attached. Of course, lower stakes may lower the temperature and may make it easier to talk about the implications of some of these measures. And transparency itself can help create accountability. Then beyond that, it's important to recognize that outcomes are not the only measures that matter, that we care about impacts and processes as well, and that those are useful for other kinds of decisions. And then the second and final implication I wanted to mention is that we need to recognize the limits of data and measurement. So what I've tried to suggest in this framework is that good measures of school performance can identify, first of all, student and school needs, answering this first question of how are the students doing, looking at the student outcome measures. Good measures can identify, different good measures can identify underperforming schools and what is the school contributing to student outcomes. And a third type of measures, the process measures, can help identify broken processes and address the question of what's happening in the school. These are all useful. They are different, but they are complementary to each other. But even all of them together are not going to give us everything we need to help improve educational performance, because measurement alone can't actually tell an educator or administrator what to do to make things better. And I think it's important for us, particularly as data analysts, to recognize that those actions for improvement, even once we've got the measures right, and once we've got a rich and comprehensive and complementary set of measures, the improvement actions are going to have to be informed by expert knowledge from the field as well. So I will stop there. We are right about at the halfway point, and we are ready to turn it over to our panelists and also to the questions that you've been sending in from the audience. So I want to thank our panelists again for joining us today. We will pull the slides down so you can see all our panelists better now. And I will turn it over to Carolyn Fenici from the Council of Chief State School Officers to moderate the discussion and kick us off with some questions. Carolyn?
Great, thank you so much, Brian. I have a couple questions to get us started, but again, for those viewing, if you want to take the time to ask a question in the chat and send it to all panelists, that is the easiest way for all of us to see it. So I guess to start, I'd like to hear from both the SEA and the district perspective, why are these sort of alternate measures important, and what sort of have you found to be the most actionable? So Donna or Evan, would you like to start from the SEA perspective?
Thank you so much. I think one of the, and thank you, Betsy, I think it's Betsy in the channel, the question that we had there. And I think one of the things that we all are and have been excited to do in developing systems under the ESSA framework is to do just that, is to build an accountability system that uses more than achievement, which is what we were, tasked with under No Child Left Behind. And in DC, we have really utilized multiple measures to a great extent, so that we actually have one of the least amount of weights possible on the achievement components, recognizing that achievement for us is measuring meeting or exceeding expectations, and those two metrics alone are just 20 points of our full accountability system. And so utilizing a heavier weight on growth, looking at other metrics such as leading indicators that are able to be measured and show meaningful differentiation across the system, things such as chronic absenteeism, looking at college career readiness metrics, looking at ways that we can expand that and make sure that we're bringing in metrics that sometimes are some inputs, but also measured by outputs, and the rest are some that are more performance. One of the things that I think is important is that when we are talking about this, we heard Brian talk about it, is that many of the things we're talking about today are not just what we call big A accountability. And really important to think about that in terms of what little a accountability means. And when we think about formal accountability or big A accountability, we are looking at, what we are using for, in our case at the state level, a federal accountability framework that meets the requirements of a law or specifics that are required. But there are many other ways that schools and districts utilize data to build their own school improvement program, to build and look at the accountability that they have to themselves within measuring their school specific goals. And I think a lot of the things that we've heard Brian talk about are ripe for that further exploration of thinking about things that might not necessarily transition or equate into a full statewide system, have great opportunities and strength in a school level development plan or school improvement plan. And all too often we are focused purely on a state level accountability framework without thinking about all the other places that these data have meaning and have impact. And I want to make sure that we are able to think about that, but specifically around, how from the state are we exploring this is, that's one of the reasons why we partnered with Mathematica to look into this, because we really wanted to think about how do we measure these things in a broader system, and then take a look at that data and then say, okay, now what can be translated into a statewide system, and what might be something that we push down and share with our schools and LEAs for something that they might be able to use at their system. So hopefully that answers the question. If not, I'll follow the chat and see if there's a follow-up.
Great, thanks, Donna. Tanya, oh, sorry, Evan.
I was just going to jump in briefly, sorry, Carolyn, to say totally agree with what Donna said about chronic absenteeism and growth being sort of leaders for us. And I think the other one that's interesting in our context that we think about quite a bit is not really a measure of inputs, but is an output that I think speaks to how folks are voting with their futures around readmission. So we look at the proportion of students who are eligible to school who do come back, and that gives us a sense for how much folks are finding their schools to be good places for their students to learn. So especially within the context of our jurisdiction, that's another way that we think about the metrics that we can use to reflect the circumstances of our jurisdiction.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, Evan, for future questions, your mic sort of floating in and out. So Tanya or Jean, from the district perspective, how are these alternate measures? Why are they important to you, and what has been particularly useful?
Sure, I can jump in. At the School District of Philadelphia, we have for over 5 years had our school progress report, which incorporated many of the ideas that Brian was talking about, in particular relying on surveys. But we also looked at credit accumulation, growth. One interesting thing, which I think really validates some of what was said today, was we had our report divided into domains. So there's an achievement domain, progress domain, climate domain, and college and career readiness domain. And we maintained the same system over 5 years. So we've been able to see movement in district and charter over that time period. Well, the climate and progress domains are the ones that moved, but not the achievement and college and career. So that's really led to some important revelations within the district in terms of thinking about sort of sequencing of performance and what's important to focus on in the beginning, right? So if we had a school that was very low on achievement out of the gate, it doesn't necessarily make sense to continue beating the school over the head with that achievement score, right? We need to look at something different and think about what has to come first. So we, to a certain extent, ended up operationalizing the idea of looking at climate and then looking at progress and progress stabilizing. All of that has actually led us to redesigning our framework now, and recognizing that since achievement was not moving over that time period, but we were building on a foundation, now we are shifting more to achievement again, but we are still keeping these other measures in mind. Related to that, I will say it's not only like thinking about a framework, you do think about something at the end of the year, but one thing that's very important and where these other areas factor in is this idea of a framework that spans not only domains, and metrics, but also space and time, really. So how do you operationalize these throughout the year? How do you make them meaningful for different stakeholders? How do you pull in across the organization? And we're in an interesting time now with our board shifting to goals and guardrails. They've adopted some real high level goals for the district. That's influencing our new framework. That's influencing our within year monitoring. That's influencing what people are looking at and talking about. So we're trying to, take into account a lot of metrics that are important at different points in time, but also expanding them across the entire organization to make them more productive for us, really.
I'll add two quick things on this. Underscoring everything that's been said about the importance of climate data. I think we'll circle back to that. The two things I'll add here are when the pandemic started, one of the areas we recognized that was an important data set is just opportunity to learn data. Where do students have the opportunity to access learning opportunities? And that data set now includes things like broadband and device access, as well as stuff that we've always considered to be essential: access to grade level content, access to rigorous and advanced courses, attendance, engagement, conditions for learning. And we're seeing districts across the nation take up the Love Challenged and Prepared Index, as well as similar indices that are relevant to the systems and the data that they have. The second thing I'll add to opportunity to learn data, and this applies to really everything I think that we're going to touch on, is just the importance of disaggregating data across subgroups, recognizing where even if a whole data set, and I saw something in here about invariance across age groups, I can't necessarily get into answer that specifically, but we may see a data trend that feels like it's headed in the right direction or wrong direction, but certain subgroups may be experiencing things in quite a different way. And so to make sure that we're continually attending to that throughout this work is another place where states, districts, and even individual schools and teachers find value in unpacking the data.
Jean sort of touched on this, but I'm wondering how the pandemic has affected your thinking around these alternate uses of data, both in the sense that, the usual standardized tests were interrupted and the fact that students are coming back to school buildings with all of these new needs.
I'm happy to just kick it off. So one of the things that's
allowed with ESSER dollars, not ESSER, is attention to needs assessments, reopening plans. And these are spaces where what we've seen just from our personal experiences and social media and public conversation, but also what the research tells us about how young brains work and develop, is attention to relationships, attention to safety and trust, attention to climate. So prioritizing some of those indicators, which I think we would describe as process indicators or leading indicators. The research is really strong that this isn't just a nice to have, that it actually drives later outcomes for students. But building that into how systems are thinking about what they're collecting, how they're investigating this, and what they're asking administrators and educators to focus on is one of the significant shifts that's been apparent. I should say that applies to adults as well. How adults are experiencing stress, how adults are experiencing climate matters a lot.
Yeah, I was going to jump in. I think we're leaning in and relying a lot more on our survey data. So we had our existing district-wide survey. That's the annual survey data of parents, students, teachers, parents, students, and teachers, and principals. But we've also had to, or decided to develop a student well-being survey that we started actually during the pandemic. And now it's something that we've expanded district-wide, that's monthly, in order to better understand and collect feedback on how students are feeling throughout the year. I think also, obviously, with the lack of outcome data from statewide assessments, we're leaning in a lot more on our within year assessments. And right now we have a universal screener for English language arts and math. And so just exploring even participation on that has become an important factor. So in terms of thinking about during fully remote, we relied on that some to understand patterns of students' engagement. But even now, we're definitely looking at the results, maybe in a different way or more intensively than we might have if we had if we did have our summative data.
Donna, Evan, anything perspective from the state level?
Evan, I'm not sure if you were going to say something. I can jump in. And, I think one of the things that is very challenging at the state level is that we do not have comparable data that tells us the status of our students across the entire state. And, not just in DC, but thinking about my colleagues in other states. And I know there are a few of them on the call. And, that's been a challenge. And so one of the things that we are all really looking forward to is being able to truly get that piece of comparable data that will give us a sense of where our students are at. Right now, we know that our schools and our districts have a variety of tools that they can use that are more diagnostic or more interim, but don't meet the same reporting requirements, don't meet the same level of measurement that a statewide assessment does. And so it tells us something very different. There are a lot of times that people will rush to try and make equating predictions from there that are challenging and can be somewhat dangerous. So I think we have to look at all of that with the sense of caution. But one of the most important things that a lot of school districts and states have prioritized is utilizing some of the additional recovery funds that have come in to think about those mental wellness supports that are necessary, whether it be bringing in mental health counselors or funding for mental health programs, investing in student well-being surveys, staff well-being surveys. Those are all things that are going to be critically important to both provide supports for as well as measure what the data is showing us to know where additional supports are needed. One of the other things that is going to be really important is how our LEAs and schools utilize some of their local assessment data to target direct supports such as high impact tutoring, extended year programs, those types of things. So absent a statewide assessment, something that we would use at more of a state level policy or a district level to think overall and shift resources, absent those tools, these diagnostic tools for schools are going to be important for how they implement those in real-time strategies that we have additional funds for right now.
I'll just add something here, which is that, and I referred to this briefly early in the presentation, but one of the things that has struck me as we've worked with both states and districts over the last year or so is that even as states have lacked the kind of information they usually get in the form of state assessments, particularly, districts very often do have a ton of information that can be useful particularly for identifying the student needs, the kinds of things that Jean was referring to. We recently did some work with Pittsburgh where we could see that, they had access not only to quarterly NWEA map assessments that were administered remotely and not just in person, but also to daily data on participation through the online learning management system. That was the kind of thing that allowed them and could allow lots of districts to have a really good idea of who the kids are who've suffered the most during the pandemic and who need to be re-engaged most urgently.
And I did just want to add, I think this is a really interesting, the situation that COVID has created in terms of the tension, or maybe not tension, but just the juxtaposition of state and local data. Reflecting back on our school progress report, which is our annual report card, when we first launched it, there were a lot of questions of why are you doing it if the state is doing it, for instance. Well, during the period, the 5 years I described, the state actually switched their report card. So we have this unbroken 5-year view of district performance across this range of measures that we wouldn't have had if we only relied on the state. And now we're seeing a second major disruption in really what the type of information that the state provides. And we, while we couldn't issue our annual report card for 1920 or 2021, we adapted so that for the things that we do have data, we did issue a report card in 1920 to ensure still some continuity. And again, as I mentioned, we're leaning in more on our within year assessment program.
So how is the best way, or how can districts and LEAs use all this data and get it in a way that's interoperable with the SEA, that can help the SEA maybe make decisions about where to send their sort of state set aside funds under these federal programs? Or how can that relationship, I guess, work the best? I stumped you all.
I think that could be, yeah, I'd be curious about both the local and state perspective on that question.
Yeah, I think that it really it's going to vary from state to state depending upon what your data system is like in terms of the types of data that LEAs feed to the SEA. So there's some variability there in terms of what you have in a data system. There are some states that have, very, very specific data feeds and commonalities that they send. And then there are others that send things in different reports. And so I think there's a little bit of a different nature. But in terms of thinking about how the state can support LEAs and schools in utilizing this data, I think it really speaks to an opportunity for focusing on data literacy and using data to make informed data decisions. And so helping the LEAs understand both not only their data, but give them a lens into what's happening in others around them. And so whether that means building some understanding of what the data says is just as much as what it doesn't say, looking at what type of actionable dashboard tools might be helpful to lead them in analyzing data in an appropriate manner and partnering them in a manner that they're asking questions about their data and not just collecting data for the sake of collecting it, but making sure that they're collecting data for the sake of using it. So not a lot of specifics there, but I really look at this as an opportunity for an enhancement of the data literacy that's so needed across our country.
I think one such oh, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Evan.
I was just going to say one such example, and hopefully my audio is coming through more clearly now, is that a lot of SEAs don't get in the space of interim assessments, for example, right? Some have aligned interim assessments, but mostly states view their assessment role as providing a state summative and sort of contextualizing those data for folks. And one of the things that we did this year, fraught in certain ways, was look at some of the interim assessment and local assessment formative assessment tools that folks are using to try and understand what are folks doing out there, and to Donna's point, to try and think about what are the tools that we know that folks are using that are high quality, aligned with what the summative ultimately expects students to know and be able to do, and also where are the places where we may need to support folks in using diagnostic tools more. And so we saw that there was a greater need for folks to understand on an interim basis how their English learners are doing, specifically in their English language acquisition. And as you can imagine, English language acquisition is sort of a question mark for us, having seen students' remote instruction experiences vary quite a bit. We want to make sure that as we're recovering, that we're prioritizing that. So we've made investments in the WIDA Access model, or excuse me, the WIDA model exam, which is aligned to Access, so that hopefully our LEAs will have a better sense for where their students are in terms of their acquisition of English language skills. So that's one such example where responding to the needs of what we're hearing from folks can be a way we sort of pivot what we think about as typically the role of an SEA. So I will say that the question, Carolyn, for me, the reason I pause is it's sort of hard to say in this moment, how does an SEA interpret its role in supporting LEAs? Because I think we're all in sort of a time where the lines around which, the boxes within which we have typically been contained, aren't as maybe have sort of different shapes and structures to them. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Evan. And so my comments will be briefer because I don't want to repeat the points that you just made. I'll name that what we recognized as all of this has emerged during the pandemic, but really prior to that, is there's a playbook for states to consider the variety of roles that they play in this. And we also generated a toolkit for principals, because the research is really clear about how impactful principals are, and specifically through their attention to climate. I saw there was a question that mentioned Camille Farrington and Dave Pinescu. These are some of the folks that we actually worked with on creating the climate for the toolkit for principals to address climate. And the reason I bring that up is that it's not an accountability conversation. One of the most profound things that we heard, and I saw this to be true when I was a school leader, is that you have all of these numbers, but we can't mistake data and student surveys for student voice. We have the numbers and the data, but the community has the story. And so it's a lot of the work that is on the opposite ends that brackets the data collection. How are we equipping people to understand the data? Some states have invested in data systems and dashboards so that across the state, everybody can look at the same indicators. And then on the back end, what do you actually do with that to create a sense of ownership and agency, where the cycle isn't just to collect the data, but to engage folks in a conversation that drives the work forward and improves climate, in fact, by talking about the climate, because people feel a sense of validation. Like, you collected this data and it didn't just drift off into some black box or your evaluation system. It's actually driving my experience on a day-to-day basis. I'll share some of these resources as we go along.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I think that brings us back to some of the initial comments around drowning in data, and even the areas that Brian was talking about, because drowning in data can happen within a year, but it also can be occurring over time, right? So while we did have the pandemic, and while we're missing PSSAs in Pennsylvania, that's our end of year for grades 3 through 8, we know a lot about what's going on, right? Outcomes didn't go up during the pandemic. Students are lagging behind. Social emotional learning has suffered. Climates are strained. And this is at least in probably large urban districts, I think across the country. Processes are impaired, right? People aren't back up and running necessarily to full speed. There's more absences because of illness and things like that. So I think thinking about the data that we had and where we were and taking that into consideration in making decisions is very important, recognizing that maybe a lot didn't change 1920, 2021. And I also think just this idea of needing to give some space and time and maybe dig in to what Jean was just saying around like the community voice. And that's, I was kind of getting to that with sort of operationalizing the data. What do people think about it? How are they processing it? How are they handling it? Especially in this time where it's not business as usual still.
So now that we have all this data, whether it's, the new opportunity to learn data during the pandemic or some of these, more innovative measures that Brian talked about, like the high school promotion, power index, how do you sort of take that data and let school and local leaders or whoever share best practices, learn from their own data and from their peers and really, sort of use this to improve outcomes and situations for students?
I mean, I could talk all day. I'm trying not to go first. But here
Go
I
ahead,
am.
Gene. Feel free.
So,
We're in our last 3 minutes anyway. So.
okay, then I'll be super quick. One of the things that we haven't named is that it's a little bit scary and disturbing the way things like SEL are getting politicized. And so one of the things that I'll just name as we're unpacking this and thinking about the equity propositions for doing this work is that the research is also clear about the long-term impacts of attention to SEL, to climate, to creating a sense of belonging for students. I think we can equip state education agencies and we can equip school leaders with the language to help communities understand that when you look at like reports from McKinsey about what are future-proof skills and studies out of Chicago on what are the school experiences that are more likely to increase graduation rates and college persistence, these are those things. It's these indicators in addition to cognitive skills and reading and writing that are equally important for folks to be successful in the workplace and in life. And if that's what we want in our richest vision of what's possible for kids, we've got to equip folks both with the data and the language to help communities understand that.
I would echo everything that Jean just said. I think one of the things that I think about is pre-pandemic, we had in DC had started something that we called our All-Star Tour, where we went and visited different schools, pulled together panels of educators and leaders within that school to talk to them about what they were doing to get specific successes, whether it was successes around attendance growth or successes around their graduation rate or college career readiness metric or something that was, leading to a high level of academic growth, a variety of different things. Maybe it was just the significant gap closure that they had made between their Hispanic Latino population that hadn't existed before. And so focusing and talking with them and learning and then developing an opportunity or a platform in which they could share that with others, I think is probably one of the more valuable ways that we can enable our schools and LEAs to share what's working for them. And then that it gets back to that data literacy piece, which, I don't have the answer to when we can expect data fluency, but I'm not really sure when that is. I think we have to keep chipping away at data literacy first, but I think we have to talk to our schools and LEAs around what all of these ideas that they're hearing from other schools, what can they take away from and implement in their schools? Because it's not going to be exactly the same. They're not going to have the same environment, but there may be pieces of things that are salient for their environment or things that they can adapt, and giving them the space and the flexibility to do that, as well as an opportunity to try some things and see how it works and then share back. And I think right now we're in an opportunity where people have a little bit of space to do that, and they have some flexibility with additional funds to, invest in things that they might not have tried before, and do that with the bottom line always being, how can we better support our students, and keeping that question first and foremost in everyone's mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you to our other panelists, and thank you for having me, and I will throw it back to Brian to close us out. Brian, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you, Carolyn. And thanks to the panelists and thanks to the audience. I'm sorry we were not able to get to all the questions that came in. There were so many of them, but I hope you've found this helpful. We'll be signing off now. Please take just 1 minute to respond to the feedback survey that you'll be getting. And I hope everyone has a chance to relax and get a bit of a break over the holidays. Thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.